Listeners, welcome. I'm so happy to have our guest today, Lindsay. How are you doing, Lindsay? Good to see you, Lindsay Vastola.
Great to see you too, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We had a great chat a little while back, and I said, why don't you come on the podcast? I'd love to talk to you about transformational leadership and a bunch of other stuff. Of course, outside of living in Japan for a year and other things about your background that I find very interesting. In fact, I was just watching a YouTube show on Japan because my son and family and I are going to be traveling there next year. So we were doing a little research and I made that connection in my mind. So I have to talk to you about that separately. But
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. So, of course, you come from a great background at corporate management in New York, big company names, et cetera. You became an entrepreneur. You told me the stories about your dad and your understanding about that. I've seen you speak and do keynotes, which has been outstanding when I've seen you do that. Of course, you're doing a lot of leadership training and coaching. So, people would think, Lindsay, as we were getting into this, what the hell does technology have to do with leadership? So, we'll get into that in a little more detail, but out the box, what is transformational leadership and why does it matter today, in your opinion?
I'll start with, whenever I work with a group and, somebody brings me in, work with our leadership team or just provide a training, the first question I ask as sort of the icebreaker, because those are obligatory, right? When you're doing
Yeah.
these trainings, I'll say, who was someone in your life, a manager, boss, a parent, a teacher, a coach, who was a leader that for you influenced the way that you think, the way that you behave, the way that you lead your life, like just had that impact. And we'll go around the room and, there's always some commonalities. It was, the manager at the first restaurant they worked at, or their dad who was an entrepreneur, or that one teacher. And and I ask them why, like, what was it that they learned from that leader? And it's interesting. I mean, they'll describe it, as they were their strength. They were consistently there for me. They were always one that did what they said they were going to do, and they rolled up their sleeves and they did it alongside of you. They commanded a quiet respect, right? And they help me see the potential that I have. And so it's interesting when we then take all of these things and then I'll reflect back on them and say, what's interesting about all of these leaders that in your life that were so influential to you, not once was it, oh, they could execute an SOP really,
Okay.
really well, or,
Yeah.
they could implement, or they created this widget that was so awesome, right? Or they cooked great food. There was nothing tangible about it. Everything was about the intangible, the feeling, the thing that actually helped them as a human, it somehow
Yep.
changed and influenced their life. And so that number one, and then second, when they're sitting there is often when you're sitting in a leadership position, whether it's as a parent or in management, if you will, or just as a coworker, we often don't appreciate the gravity of the influence that we have on others, just like we saw the gravity of the influence that that
Mhm.
other person had on us. And so when we
Mhm.
talk about transformational leadership, it's really this, I think that my favorite definition of leadership is the ability to influence others. And
Mhm.
when you hold that, how do you do that? And so for
Right.
me, transformational leadership and why it matters in business and in life is this ability to have a clear vision, like a real
Mhm.
clear. And when I say vision, it's like, where are we going? What's the North Star? What's the point of this
Mhm.
business or this task? And being able to then create influence, believe in it so big and so boldly that then almost forces you to find people you can bring along with you. And that means, how do you hold them accountable? How do you clearly define expectations? How can you get people to be vested in that vision alongside of you? And that to me is sort of the definition for me as I see in practice in transformational leadership.
Yeah. And today, we were talking before the pod, I told you that I really think a lot of leadership in these organizations and the functionality of them, they're very broken.
Yeah.
Um, is that why this is more important than ever? I mean, why does this style of leadership matter more, in your opinion?
There's a great book by Tim Elmore called The Eight Paradoxes of Great Leadership. And I think he does a
Mm.
great job of just, it's almost like be this, but also this, like be confident, but also humble. And he talks about these paradoxes where, if we look at generations of business, well, when we were in, Fifth Avenue, 50-story buildings, and everybody went to the office, and it was a very directive style of leadership. There was an objective to get done. And so it was the quote unquote boss's job to push down those directives.
Right.
Well, now with the change in the products and services we're selling that require, right, more creative thinking, more collaboration, it's not as directive. Transformational leadership is so important now because, we've talked about this too. It's the different generations and the different things that
Yep.
we value.
Yep.
How we look at work, very different than 40 years ago. Work now is more directed. I think most, they show the Gen X, and I guess it's Gen Alpha, really
Hmm.
connecting work to purpose.
Yep.
And you can't benefit and bonus someone's, lack of purpose, right? And so how do we influence them in a way that they find purpose, yet not at the cost of performance? And that's something
Yeah.
that's a challenge for a lot of leaders today, is we want people to find purpose in their work and provide quote unquote work-life balance, and but not at the cost of performance. And so it takes this unique skill set as a leader now to be able to toe that line, so that you get the productivity we need in our businesses, but also be able to provide that purpose for, across generations in our workforce.
Yeah. Great insight. So, when we're talking about leadership and transformation, we're also talking about teams, right? Groups of people, especially with the new nature of work that you're talking about, especially with the mandates to come back to the office and all these other things. So let's talk about productivity in teams, and how do we address that? What do you see as those challenges in particular right now?
I'd say if you were to ask me the singular, there's probably 2 to 3 challenges that I see that layer on each other. At the core is expectation management and clear
Hmm.
accountability. When I'll work with teams and I'll do, whether it's maybe like through 360 feedback or just getting their insights, the single thing that frustrates them, that makes them feel like they're not as productive and purposeful in their role, is when they do not feel like they have clear expectations set for them.
Hmm.
People crave accountability. At least your A players do. They want to be accountable. They want to know exactly what they're expected to do. And what has muddied this, I think, is sort of that second layer of challenge, is communication. So we don't have clear, um, if we don't define communication in our organizations, then it leaves everybody to their own style. So again, I'm using the comparison. If we're talking about how technology has changed the dynamics of businesses,
Hmm.
even 25, 30 years ago, when everybody went to the office and you could call everybody into the meeting room around the table, you talk about the issue, you leave, everybody has their items that they know they're expected to do. Well, now, especially in the fitness industry, if you have 15 clubs and everybody's
Hmm.
dispersed, or and then you're talking on Teams, and you're talking on Voxer, and you're talking on
Hmm.
WhatsApp and email and text message, and then there's some guys who just like to pick up the phone and
Oh,
have the conversation.
right.
And I tell you, I can name, like, off the top of my head, like the clients that I work with. It's like almost the very first question I will ask them, like, what's the culture of communication here?
That's
Because
right.
the owner loves to pick up the phone and wants to just have a conversation with you, but their regional manager is like texting or sending long emails. How can we create a real, like, systematize that in the business, so there's
Mhm.
clear direction and clear expectation around communication? Once you have clear communication and clear expectations attached to that big vision that we were talking about, man, everything just becomes so much more manageable. It's easier to navigate conflict or where there might be tension because you have that bedrock in place.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard to do because you have to be very intentional about it. I mean,
So intentional.
we were talking about that before. I mean, you can't make assumptions. I mean, it's just you have to figure it out together. What have you, as you go through this, what other strategies have you deployed to help teams navigate these challenges?
One of the best strategies is literally to create an SOP for communication. So
Mm,
when do you meet in person? When do you email something? When do you
mhm,
submit a form that, if you're
mhm,
if you're asking for money or, you need something special for a resource, right? Is there another protocol that you go through for that? And then when can you just ping back and forth on Teams? And humans, the human condition, we require at least 7 times to have
mhm.
something repeated to us for the information to stick. So when I hear leaders talk about kind of in jest, it's like, oh, I'm just the CRO, the chief reminding officer. All I do, is tell them, tell them, tell them. And we get angry at it or frustrated. Well, how many times did that leader probably have to be reminded to do something or, for a piece of information to really stick and have legs? It's just human. And so as leaders, if we can understand our people need to be trained, reinforced, it needs to be written, it needs to be
Mhm.
talked about regularly in meetings, it needs to
Yep.
be embedded in our onboarding, embedded in our culture. It needs shared accountability. So coworkers need to say, when we kind of let the one text go by, hey, you know what, put that in Teams because that's where it belongs. And they have to understand why it's important. That's where I think a gap is with
Yep.
leaders often is they'll put together an SOP, but if the people who have to go and execute it don't understand
That's
why it's important for them and for the business. And as a leader, again, this is, we were talking earlier, this unique skill set as leaders with so much technology as these wheelhouses that we have to navigate our businesses with that are great tools, but it requires us to be exceptional communicators.
mhm.
And one of those things is just, yeah, write that SOP. What does the culture of communication look like? Roll it out, remind it, reinforce it, and culturate it, and remind them of the why. And it really, like that alone, if you can spend 90 days to 6 months really focused on that, it can change the dynamics of any size organization.
Yeah, boy, that's so true. And it's also the way you conduct yourselves because you can put everything down in an SOP and get very, but if you're saying that, but then the way you yourself show up and how you do things, you can't very well expect people to do stuff that you're not doing yourself. Yeah, the other thing, it's from my own experiences, is the notion this is a discipline. It's a discipline. It's like working out. You're not going to go in there do your arm day and look like Arnold Schwarzenegger the next day. You have to do it over and over and over and over again, where people start. It becomes a default where they don't think as much about it. And you're right. I think the why is very, very important. And the other aspect we were talking about is earlier. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. I think also it's a cultural sense of people's sense of fear. They don't want to make a mistake, or they're spending a lot of time trying to cover their butts, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so the nature of the communication itself can become kind of unhinged for the purpose of it because it's covering other things versus getting down to the point in the most efficient way possible to get work done, versus all the other stuff. Is I've gone into organizations, in the C-suite or CEO role, and I'll listen for the first few months. I'll attend a bunch of meetings, and you sit back and you go, "Why are we having these meetings? Like, why are we having these meetings?" Um, so anyway, any comments on that?
Oh, there's a client I'm working with right now, and they just had their big quarterly. They're ramping from 50 million to $100 million company, so they've got some big things at play. But it's interesting because they're still in many ways operating. I work with the COO, and she said, "I feel like we're in puberty," and as an organization,
Yeah.
meaning like we don't know our identity. We're like a big business, but we're still a small business. We don't know how to conduct ourselves. We don't know how to have healthy tension. We don't know how
Yep.
to have hard conversations because when we were a small business, we could kind of get past those. They didn't really have the same implications. And so they're in this weird growth phase. And I think a lot of businesses are there. I told her, I said, we're splitting the bill on this one because I'm using that. It's such a great analogy for businesses when you're in this like weird, awkward stage. And that's where
Right.
a leader really has to identify what are the fears that are driving, what are the underlying, whether it's our front line. So in a gym, like if our frontline people at the front desk are afraid of making a mistake because we have not created a culture of feedback, if we've not created a culture with clear expectations, if we've not created that culture of clear communication, of course we're going to be driving every one of our actions from fear. And
Yep.
that throttles the potential of the business. And then it leaves the leadership just saying, like, I wish they would perform better. I wish they
Mhm.
would step it up. And it goes back to what I say. Is they crave feedback. I have
Mhm.
a regional director I work with, and he came from another industry that was very corporate. And he said, as hard as it was, the thing that I looked forward to most was my quarterly reviews because I knew that I would be told exactly what I'm doing well and what I need to work on. And he's an A player, right? And so in the new organization, they don't have that. And so he's wondering, am I even performing? Am I, they're keeping me, but are they keeping me because they don't want to fire me? Am I really doing a good job? So now all of his decisions are from fear. He's
Yeah.
holding back his own potential. He's holding back his team because he's so afraid of making a mistake. And
Mhm.
and I will oversimplify it when I say if that leader, like if we just put in a cadence of regular feedback, we can quiet a lot of those fears and have people really thrive because they're not being they're not being driven by the unknown.
Yeah, and you have to also make sure they're not like the kid touching the hot thing on the stove too. If you're drawing them out to overcome that, you got to protect them to make sure they're not burned too many times because that's
Absolutely.
the other side of that coin. So let's turn this to tech and technology. So in your work, just now you talked about high performers, communication, leadership mindsets. But then there's technology. You alluded to the communication strategy before and an SOP about that and how work actually gets done.
Mhm.
Um, how is tech affecting these things? You alluded to some of it just a little while ago. You see this requirement to get back to the office. You see all these headlines and things. What do you see in the realm of technology's impact regarding transformational leadership and how people do things in a group or a team?
If I were before getting granular, as kind of the if we were to scope out, technology gives us speed. It gives us efficiency. It gives us access. But I don't know, fear or what I see is sometimes it can make the people part a little lazy.
Mhm.
And we see this in our, how frustrated we get when we have to speak to like an automated, person instead of like, can I just speak to a human? The people piece, EQ, emotional intelligence, that ability to have conversations with people, to understand the needs, whether it's in our staff or with our clients, members, is the competitive advantage. Because when we can implement technologies, let's just take a CRM, right? So I'm working with a club chain right now, and they're implementing a CRM, which is like, my gosh, that's like, it feels like sometimes, turning the world upside down. That can really bottleneck performance in a company. Like, it's a technology that seems like a great tool that's going to speed up our processes. It's going to help us in all these different ways. But are we doing that at the cost of really building our teams to understand how to use it, how to communicate it, how to be efficient? And that's really where I think sometimes, because it's split attention. We're implementing this technology and we're not giving what our teams need in order to implement it successfully. And that's actually where the speed ends up being pulled back, because I don't want to say laziness, but we haven't taken what was really required to bring
Mhm.
our teams up to speed so that we can actually run twice as quick with the technology in place. So again, these are these leadership skills that, 40 years ago, we didn't have to implement in the same way. And there's no there that you have to be agile. You have to really know the nuances of your teams. There's going to be people on your team that they're learning behaviors, they're learning styles. Some are going to be able to drink out of a 5-gallon jug. You tell them all the technology, how it's going to help, how to use it, how to implement it, and they can take it and run with it, no problem. Love those people, usually. They'll have their own things that would be challenged. Then you have your players who it's more like they like to drink out of a, out of a wine bottle, right? With a small, like give them a little bit of information at a time, let it stick, a little bit more information at a time. It takes a little more time. It doesn't mean that they're not as great performers or not as valuable, but as a leader, I have to have the ability to discern how my people on my team are taking in information, applying it, communicating it, and they're not going to do it like me. And that's where I see a lot of leaders get frustrated. This is just human condition. So I hope that gives a sense of, when we're talking about the intersection of people and technology, as a leader, it's this unique blend, this unique skill set where EQ is the competitive advantage. If we can get them to have awareness and understand how to make that technology work to our benefit even quicker, that's what's going to, I think, more successfully implement these technologies into our businesses.
Yeah, it's challenging, like you said, the paradox, right? It's challenging to both futurize a company while you're humanizing it at the same time. They are paradoxes to that. And I think Bryan on the prior podcast we just published with AI Front Desk, he talked about the deployment of these technologies for automation using these different technology tools, and he talks about, well, why do these things fail in that thing? And, talk about tech. And he really echoed a lot of the things you're talking about, where this disconnect. And I like the term laziness because I do think there's a realm of reality there where people go from here to there overnight. They don't realize the implications of those things. As he mentions in that pod, he talks about, some people deploy these bots and they're not really watching out what's going on from a human experience perspective. And all of a sudden, it actually is a tool that makes things worse, not better, Yeah.
It can breed complacency in some realms. I
Yeah.
think in many ways, actually, the work cut out for leaders in many ways is harder,
Yes.
because they have to communicate, over communicate, communicate in 7 different ways, 7 different
Yes.
times. And it's an endurance sport. Leadership is an endurance sport. You are never there because the next technology that you're implementing, you're going to have to
Yeah.
do that over again and still maintain that culture of support and empathy and, reward and purpose. It's a lot of hats you have to wear from a
It
leader standpoint.
is. It is. And as we talked about with EQ, it's mindfulness, it's self awareness, right? So, in your coaching and kind of what you emphasize with daily habits and self leadership, for example, you talk about aim for the center strategy. So,
Mhm.
these are some tools because you have to work at that to keep your mind like it's just, if you, and the way you work at that is first you have to recognize it's a real thing. And you have to then, exercise those muscles. What are some of your views on that kind of aim for the center and some of the disciplines people need to be thinking about?
There's a football coach that used to tell his team to act medium. And what he meant by that was emotionally, when your emotions get too high because you're winning and you're in a streak, that can lead to complacency, because it's
Right.
just we're winning and we're great. On the flip side, when you're in a slump, when you're not winning, when you just keep getting hit, the energy required to bring yourself back to what he calls medium is it requires a lot. And this is, I think,
Yeah.
as entrepreneurs, leaders, we go through the ups and downs. The
Hmm.
key here is to recognize what medium looks like for
Right.
you and
Right.
how do you get there. Are you sleeping enough? Do you have the right people around you? Are you exercising? Like all the things we talk about in our industry, right? And what's required to get to medium. And so in these fluctuations that are just natural in business and in interpersonal relationships, you have the one conversation that, you blew up in a meeting, right? And you've got to get back to medium because if not, that's you're going to take that home with you, or you're going to take it into your next team meeting. So when we talk about a leadership standpoint, what if everyone on our team, from top down, side to side, all had the awareness of what their medium looks like? That means when they're performing at their best, when they're most level-headed, when they can have hard conversations but not do it in a reactionary way. If everybody understood that about themselves, how are we now showing up as a team and understanding that as a team, right? What takes us off medium as a team? This kind of awareness is so critical to build into
Yeah.
a culture that wants to grow at scale, especially, and a culture
Yep.
where people want to work and they're not driven from fear. So with that sort of like act medium, aim for center as sort of a core theme, I love, one of the keynotes I talk about is, I call it pardon the pattern interrupt. Like, we're humans, we go to work, we do the thing, we do it over and over again, and we do the thing. We need these pattern interrupts. And a pattern interrupt in a business could be, taking taking your team to an offsite, whatever, axe throwing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your quarterly meetings, don't do it in a conference room. Like,
Mm-hmm.
rent a cool house or a cool building that puts people in a different environment, that gets them to think differently. Our brains require that, especially if we want our teams to bring creativity and openness and collaboration. That idea of pattern interrupt, I think, is important from a personal leadership standpoint, so that we stay at medium. The grind is what gets us off course. And then how do we do that as a team? I think really builds a culture, so that when we throw in new technologies, or we throw in the fact that we're talking on 12 different modes of communication, it gives us a level playing field to have these critical conversations.
Yeah, and today, would you say that, I think this, but I could, people think differently. So, for example, there's a performative aspect of our lives today that's heightened because of social media. I'm living my best life all the time, and generally people, and don't be upset with me because I get this. What are you excited about, Brian? I'm like, I don't get excited. I get excited when it's Christmas and with my wife, and that's it. And that's really kind of the median thing, It's like, but in today's world, that seems so, it's like, you're not excited every day. It's like, nobody can live at that level over the median all the time, because eventually it's got to correct, right?
Gosh, and you hit such a great point, because there's this, I think maybe this external expectation that going into work every day should be exciting and
Yeah.
purposeful and amazing and full of passion and excitement. And 80% is just the discipline to do the things
The
that are,
things,
call them the grind, call them the
right?
requirements. Like, but as a leader, if you can keep people understanding that 80% of the grind is what gets them that 20% differential, that makes this a great place to work, that celebrates that big win, right? It's just that, then it doesn't become mundane.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be coded with, I agree, there's a lot of this myopic, you see the 30-second blips of what's great, the wins, and it
Right.
takes our mind off of the 80% of the things, the disciplines that actually are required to move a business forward from a sense of self-purpose and what we're doing. It's not going to be the shiny rainbows. And then usually that's the part of the journey that aren't the shiny rainbows are the ones that grow the most.
That's right. That's absolutely true. I agree with that, honestly.
Brian,
So,
next time I ask you, I'm going to be like, what's not exciting? What's pulling you down right now?
well, exciting isn't the opposite of being pulled down, but maybe I don't know.
Exactly.
But yeah, I knew you'd like that, because I think I told you that in our last call.
You
I don't
did.
get
You
excited,
did.
only Christmas and my wife. So that's funny. So, in wrapping this up, and thanks again, Lindsay. And by the way, in the show notes, you're going to see how to connect with Lindsay online and follow her on LinkedIn. And she produces some great content. Our website is good as well, so you'll see all those links. So, I always like to kind of end this up for our audience with some pearls of wisdom. You working with leaders and executives and teams, and what you know about with respect to transformational leadership, the things you try to coach people on relative to being mindful, the things they need to do, the tools. If you were going to, give some insights, a couple of points for a business owner, a professional, a person in their human life, given all these things, What are some recommendations that you'd give to anybody to be looking for? What are the things that are pearls of wisdoms that you would want to share with the audience?
Thank you. And thank you, Bryan, for having me. I'd say there's a couple that stand out. I owned a gym for 15 years. And I think what made it, I don't want to say sales was easy for me, or, hiring and leading a great team was easy for me. But what made it, I don't know if there's no visual, I'm doing air quotes. What made it easier for me was clarity of vision, and to find people, clients, vendors, people, employees who are vested in the vision, not just vested in the job or vested in the thing. And it sounds a little like big and maybe a little euphoric, but um, it's so important. People are craving a North Star, and they want a leader who will show them that. And so when your language, your conversations start with the vision, man, closing the sale becomes easier. So if you as the leader, those listening to this probably are nodding their head saying, yeah, I know. But what's key now is, how do you get your teams to be able to communicate that vision with as much conviction as you do yourself? So vested in the vision and being a master communicator of your vision. Second would be EQ over IQ all day long. And this is where the humanness, especially if we're talking about technology, which is really, it's IQ, right? It's a thing. I can teach somebody how to operate a CRM, or how to use,
Yeah.
AI. I can teach that IQ. But that competitive advantage where we really can leverage technology is when we embrace emotional intelligence, when we train it, when we develop it, when we hire to it, when we operationalize it in our business. And for as the quote unquote soft skills, we can put these into our systems and build them into the ethos of our companies in a very tangible way. And one way, which would be sort of my third pearl of wisdom, is embrace accountability. This is the single most challenging, biggest challenge that I think owners and leaders have, is how to hold others accountable. I just shared that 17-inch plate analogy. The
Yep.
home plate in baseball is always 17 inches. And we don't keep the pitcher on the mound on our team. If he can't pitch over the 17 inches, we don't keep him on the team just because he's a nice guy, or because we, don't want to have the hard conversation to cut him from the team. We don't make the plate wider for him. And so many of us make the plate wider in our businesses because we lack leadership skill. We lack accountability. We don't have clear expectations. When we hold that plate, we're going to have the A players. We're going to be able to then leverage technology in the way that it's intended, because we're not ambiguous with how we want to run our businesses and run our teams. And people crave that. They really do. They may not say it out loud, but that accountability piece for all of us is really important. So vested in the vision, EQ over IQ. We are human. Let's just remember, we're just humans, imperfect humans, that want to build something great and be part of something great with purpose, and the accountability piece that helps us actually achieve that potential.
Lindsay, thank you so much for your wisdom and spending time today with our audience. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Bryan. I appreciate you very much. Thank you for listening.